Now, watch this before I go much further into this parable. If you consider the common sense factor and use that to bolster your allegory, right, which the allegory is based on the common sense factors of those three elements, if we only use Matthew's account and I think Mark's account, and we skip Luke for a second, we skip the last part where it says, no one after drinking old wine desires new, for he says the old is good. If, according to historic Christianity, what Jesus is teaching is that the new is better than the old, and that his new teachings are going to be replacing the old way of approaching God through the Jewish law system and law keeping and all those rituals, all those are old and those are out, and the new covenant is in, the New Testament is in, the new people of God are in, the new scriptures are in, all that stuff, and the new is better, then that seems all well and fine if you just read Matthew and Mark. But if you read Luke, then suddenly when Jesus says in verse 39, and no one after drinking old wine desires new, for he says the old is good, suddenly that analogy disrupts the whole allegorical picture. Suddenly Jesus is implying no one after drinking old wine desires new, for he says the old is good, or in some versions it renders the old is better. Wait a minute, Jesus, if the new thing that you're introducing is supposed to be superior to the old, then why would you use an analogy or a parable in the final list of your analogies in Luke and say, if you compare the old and the new, everyone wants the old because it's better. The old is good. See how that upsets the apple cart to the analogy or the allegorical version of the new is replacing the old because the new is superior to the old, right? If Judaism is the old and Christianity is the new, well, then basically what Yeshua is saying in verse 39 is, no one after experiencing Judaism desires Christianity, for he says Judaism is good. Or we can just fill in blank with whatever, no one after following after the law of Moses desires the law of Christ because he says the law of Moses is good. Or no one after being a part of the people known as Israel desires to be a part of the people known as Christianity or the church, for he says Judaism is good or better. You understanding the logical disconnect or the problem that this last little element, verse 39, presents, throws a monkey wrench into the whole allegorical version of, hey, Yeshua was just trying to tell us that the new is better and this is his new system. All right, so having said all of that, let's continue looking at my own commentary from a Messianic point of view. We've already worked through multiple Christian commentaries, Pastor John MacArthur, Pastor John Piper, Pastor David Guzik, gotquestions.org, and things like that. This is the historical Christian view that's typically going to launch into the allegorical midrash, homily, sermon perspective of Jesus is telling us that the system known as Judaism is on its way out and it's run its course and blah, blah, blah. That's the perspective you're going to find if you read your average Christian commentary. Go back and listen to my own studies and you'll see what I was talking about. Now let's look at this perspective from the lens of someone who doesn't believe that the Torah is on its way out, that Judaism is being replaced by Christianity and things like that. We're looking at this through the lens of Dr. David Stern, author of the Complete Jewish Bible, as well as the author of the Jewish New Testament commentary and things like that. He's a Messianic Jew, which means he's a Jewish believer in Jesus who believes that the law of Moses is still relevant for us in our lives on a practical everyday basis. So he doesn't subscribe to replacement theology, supersessionism, and forms of dispensationalism that teaches that the church is in and Judaism's out, laws out, Christianity's in, New Testament's in, things like that. I myself would also fall into the same camp of disagreeing with supersessionism, replacement theology. I think all of those are bad ideologies, and I think you should pitch them. So David Stern continues. We've been looking at this over the last few weeks. Let's pick it up where we left off. Last week we read this very end of this commentary. I'll read our paragraph. I'll read this part again. He says, if one tries to put new wine, and this is David Stern, he says, which is Messianic faith, into old wineskins, which is traditional Judaism, the faith is lost and Judaism is ruined. But if Judaism is freshly prepared, that is reconditioned so that it can accommodate trust in Yeshua the Messiah, then both the faith and the renewed Judaism, which is Messianic Judaism, both of them are preserved. So what David Stern is presenting us with is an alternative way to understand the analogy. He's still working from the allegory somewhat, but he's changing some of the elements. He's realizing that it's not necessary to, what have I been saying? Throw the baby out with the bathwater. We don't have to do that. Instead, what we can do is recognize that if we reform the baby, or recondition the water or whatever, we can throw out the bathwater, but we don't have to lose the baby in the process. What David Stern is suggesting is, instead of Yeshua coming to simply rip up the old system and replace it with a brand new one, including the law of Moses being replaced by a completely new law known as the law of Christ, and the Old Testament being replaced by the New Testament, Israel's place being discarded in favor of a new people group known as the church, etc., etc. Instead of all of that taking place, instead, what Yeshua came to do is simply reform the system. In other words, we are preserving the original elements, but we're taking them back to their original God-intended purposes. We have to remember that the law of Moses is not Moses' invention. It's only called the law of Moses because he was the agent that was used by God to pen the words, to write it out. He's the one that God inspired to write the words down. But the words are God's. So to that extent, we have to remind ourselves that God's words are pure. They're perfect. They're just. They're right. They're spiritual. Paul goes on to say in Romans chapter 7. So God's words had no fault. They didn't need to be replaced.